Maria Santos had been cleaning office buildings for 12 years, but she had never encountered someone quite like Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., she would arrive at the downtown corporate complex with her cart full of supplies, her uniform pressed and her determination unwavering. The early hours suited her perfectly. She could work in peace while the city still slept, finishing her rounds before the business crowds arrived. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Maria pushed her cart through the marble lobby of the Meridian Tower, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. She had developed a rhythm over the years, an efficient dance of dusting, mopping, and organizing that she could perform almost without thinking. The building housed several companies, from law firms to consulting groups, and each floor had its own personality and challenges. As she stepped into the elevator, Maria noticed a man in a crisp business suit already inside. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with graying temples and an incredibly straight posture that made her think of soldiers she had seen in movies. What struck her most, however, was how he looked directly at her and nodded politely, offering a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "You're here early today." Maria was surprised. In 12 years of cleaning offices, she could count on one hand the number of times someone in an expensive suit had acknowledged her existence, let alone started a conversation. Most people looked through her as if she were invisible, part of the building's fixtures rather than a human being. "Good morning, sir," she replied softly, adjusting her grip on the handle of her cart. "I always start early, less disruption for everyone." The man extended his hand. "I'm James Mitchell. I just started consulting with Henderson and Associates on the 15th floor." Maria hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand. His grip was firm but not overwhelming, and he maintained eye contact throughout. "Maria Santos. I clean most of the building." "Nice to meet you, Maria. I have a feeling we'll be seeing each other regularly." When the elevator reached the 15th floor, James held the door open for her, another small gesture that caught Maria off guard. As she wheeled her cart out, she found herself wondering about this polite stranger. There was something different about him, something in the way he carried himself and treated others that set him apart from the typical corporate executives she encountered. The 15th floor of Meridian Tower was home to Henderson and Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm that specialized in organizational development and strategic planning. Maria had been cleaning their offices for 3 years, and she knew the space intimately. The reception area featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the city skyline, modern furniture that looked impressive, but wasn't particularly comfortable, and abstract artwork that probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months. As she began her cleaning routine, Maria could hear James talking with the receptionist who had arrived early. His voice carried a natural authority, but there was warmth in it too. She found herself listening as he discussed his background, mentioning something about retiring from the military after 22 years of service. That explained the posture and the respectful demeanor, she thought. Over the next hour, as Maria worked her way through the offices, she noticed James several more times. He was setting up in a corner office, unpacking boxes and organizing files with military precision. Every time their paths crossed, he acknowledged her with a nod or a brief greeting. It was such a small thing, but it made Maria's work feel a little less invisible. Around 7 a.m., as Maria was emptying waste baskets in the break room, James appeared with an empty coffee mug. Instead of simply rinsing it and leaving, he struck up another conversation. "Maria, can I ask you something?" he said, leaning against the counter. "How long have you been working in this building?" 3 years on this floor, 12 years total in different buildings around the city," she replied, continuing to replace the trash bag. "And you do all this by yourself, the whole building?" Maria nodded. "Most of it. There's another cleaner who does the upper floors, but I handle floors 1 through 20. James whistled softly. "That's impressive. I bet you know this place better than anyone who works here." It was true, though Maria had never thought of it that way. She knew which offices stayed late and generated more trash, which bathrooms needed extra attention, which conference rooms were used most frequently. She knew the quirks of every floor, from the law firm partners who insisted on having their offices cleaned in a specific order to the tech startup employees who left energy drink cans everywhere. "I suppose I do," she said with a small smile. "You notice things when you're here every day." James nodded thoughtfully. "I bet you do. experience and observation are valuable commodities. There was something in the way he said it that made Maria look up from her work. He wasn't making small talk or being patronizing. He seemed genuinely interested in her perspective, treating her knowledge and experience as something worthwhile. "Mr. Mitchell," Maria said, surprising herself with her boldness, "can I ask what kind of consulting you do?" "Organizational development, mostly. I help companies figure out how to run more efficiently, how to solve problems they might not even know they have." He paused, studying her face. "Why do you ask?" Maria felt her cheeks warm. "Just curious. I've seen a lot of consultants come and go over the years, most of them." She trailed off, not wanting to speak negatively about the people who worked in the building. "Most of them what?" James encouraged. "Most of them seem to focus on the big picture stuff without really understanding how things work day to day. They interview the executives and managers, but they never talk to people like me who see everything that actually happens." James set down his coffee mug and turned to face her fully. "That's a very astute observation, Maria, and you're absolutely right. Too many consultants make recommendations without understanding the ground-level reality." Maria finished with the trash and moved to wipe down the counters. She could feel James watching her work, but it didn't make her uncomfortable. Instead, she found herself working with even more care and precision than usual, taking pride in the smooth efficiency of her movements. "Maria," James said suddenly, "I have an idea, but first let me ask you something else. Do you enjoy cleaning?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Well, I'm good at it. I take pride in doing it well." "That's not what I asked. Do you enjoy it?" Maria considered the question seriously. "Parts of it. I like seeing something dirty become clean. I like the order and the routine, but—" She hesitated. But sometimes I wonder if there's more I could do, more I could contribute." The words came out in a rush, and Maria immediately felt embarrassed. Why was she sharing such personal thoughts with a stranger? James didn't seem surprised or uncomfortable with her honesty. Instead, he nodded slowly. "I thought so. You strike me as someone with a lot more to offer than just cleaning skills, impressive as those clearly are." Before Maria could respond, other employees began arriving for the day. The spell of their early morning conversation was broken as the building came to life around them. James gathered his coffee mug and headed toward his office, but he paused in the doorway. "Maria, would you be interested in helping me with something? A project that could use your unique perspective on how this place really works." Maria stared at him, her cleaning cloth frozen in her hand. "What kind of project?" "Let me think about it today and get back to you. But I have a feeling you might be exactly what I need for this assignment." As James disappeared into his office, Maria finished cleaning the break room in a daze. In 20 minutes of conversation, this stranger had seen something in her that 12 years of employers had missed. She didn't know what kind of project he had in mind, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flutter of excitement about something other than her predictable daily routine. The rest of her morning passed quickly as she moved through her remaining tasks, but her mind kept returning to James Mitchell and his unexpected interest in her perspective. She found herself working with renewed energy, seeing her familiar environment with fresh eyes. Maybe there really was more she could contribute beyond making sure the floors were spotless and the trash was emptied. By 11 a.m., Maria had finished her rounds and was preparing to leave for her afternoon job at a medical office across town. As she waited for the elevator, James appeared in the hallway, carrying a folder and wearing a thoughtful expression. "Maria, perfect timing," he said. "I've been thinking about our conversation all morning." "Oh," Maria tried to keep her voice casual, but her heart was beating a little faster. "I'd like to propose something to you, but it would require you to trust me and step outside your comfort zone. Are you interested in hearing more?" Maria looked into his eyes and saw the same respect and genuine interest that had surprised her earlier. Whatever he was proposing, she sensed it could change everything about her routine existence. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm interested." James smiled, and Maria had the distinct feeling that her life was about to take an unexpected turn. She had no idea just how dramatically everything was about to change, or how a simple conversation between a cleaning lady and a former Special Forces officer would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own potential. The next morning, Maria arrived at Meridian Tower with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that made her hands slightly unsteady as she prepared her cleaning cart. She had spent the previous evening wondering what James Mitchell had in mind, running through dozens of possibilities in her head. Her daughter, Sophia, a college sophomore studying business, had been particularly excited when Maria shared the story of their conversation. "Mama, this could be your chance," Sophia had said over dinner. "You always tell me about the problems you see in those offices, how things could be done better. Maybe someone is finally ready to listen." As Maria rode the elevator to the 15th floor, she tried to calm her racing thoughts. She had barely slept, alternating between excitement and self-doubt. What could a cleaning lady possibly offer to a military consultant? What if she had misunderstood his interest? What if he had changed his mind overnight? When the elevator doors opened, James was waiting in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and a warm smile. He was dressed more casually today, in khakis and a polo shirt, but his military bearing was still unmistakable. "Good morning, Maria. I hope you don't mind, but I brought you coffee. I figured we could talk before the rest of the office arrives." Maria accepted the coffee gratefully, nodding that he had somehow remembered exactly how she liked it from watching her prepare it in the break room the day before. It was black with just 1 sugar, and the thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her more than she expected. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. That's very kind. Please call me James, and I should thank you for being willing to listen to what I'm sure sounds like a crazy idea." They walked toward the conference room at the end of the hall, and James gestured for Maria to sit at the polished table where she had cleaned around important meetings for 3 years, but never imagined herself participating in one. "Maria, let me tell you about the project Henderson and Associates has hired me to complete," James began, settling into the chair across from her. "They're experiencing significant efficiency problems. Productivity is down, employee satisfaction is low, and they're losing clients despite having talented people and good systems on paper." Maria nodded. She had observed these problems firsthand, though no one had ever asked for her perspective. She had seen the stress on employees' faces, overheard frustrated phone calls, and noticed the increasing number of late-night pizza boxes in trash cans as people worked longer hours to keep up with demands. "The senior partners think they know what the problems are," James continued. "They've given me a list of suspected issues: communication breakdowns, outdated technology, poor project management, standard corporate consulting stuff." "But you don't think that's the real problem?" Maria asked. James leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "I spent 22 years in special forces, Maria. I learned that the most critical intelligence often comes from people who are present but invisible, who observe everything but aren't part of the command structure. In the military, that might be local civilians or support staff. In a corporate environment, it might be the cleaning lady," Maria finished, beginning to understand where this was heading. "Exactly. You see this office when people think no one is watching. You observe the real dynamics, the actual workflow, the genuine problems that people might not even realize they're creating or might be too embarrassed to admit to management." Maria felt a surge of validation. For years, she had watched inefficiencies and problems that seemed obvious to her but invisible to the people in charge. She had seen important documents left carelessly on desks where anyone could read confidential client information. She had observed which employees consistently stayed late not because of heavy workloads, but because they spent hours in unproductive meetings or dealing with system failures. She had watched personality conflicts play out in ways that affected entire departments. "So what exactly are you proposing?" she asked, though her excitement was growing with each passing moment. James pulled out a folder and opened it on the table between them. "I want you to be my partner on this project. Not as a cleaning lady who happens to have opinions, but as a legitimate consultant who specializes in observational analysis and operational efficiency." Maria's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "I'm sorry, what?" "I've done some research on you, Maria. I hope you don't mind, but I asked around yesterday." James pulled out several sheets of paper. "Your supervisor at the cleaning company says you're the most reliable and observant employee they've ever had. You've identified maintenance problems that saved building management thousands of dollars. You've caught security issues that could have been serious problems. You reorganized the supply closets on 3 floors and increased efficiency by 30%. Maria stared at him. She had done those things, but she had never thought of them as anything special. They were just common sense improvements that made her job easier. But I'm not educated like you, she protested. I never went to college. I don't know anything about business consulting. Maria, I have 2 master's degrees and 22 years of military experience. But yesterday, you identified a core problem with corporate consulting in about 30 seconds that it took me years to figure out. Education is valuable, but observation and common sense are irreplaceable. James pulled out another document. I've already spoken with the partners at Henderson and Associates. I told them I wanted to bring in a specialist in operational observation and workplace efficiency analysis. I didn't tell them you were currently working as a cleaner. That's your decision to make or not make. Maria's head was spinning. What would I have to do? For the next month, you would continue your cleaning rounds, but you'd also be documenting everything you observe that affects workplace efficiency. Employee behavior, workflow patterns, system failures, communication breakdowns, anything that impacts productivity. Then you'd work with me to analyze the data and develop recommendations. And they would pay me for this. James quoted a figure that made Maria nearly drop her coffee cup. It was more than she made in 3 months at both of her current jobs combined. James, this is incredible, but I don't understand. Why me? Why not hire someone with experience in this kind of work? James leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, his professional demeanor gave way to something more personal. Can I tell you a story, Maria? She nodded. When I was deployed in Afghanistan, our unit was trying to figure out why supply convoys kept getting ambushed on a particular route. We had intelligence officers, analysts, satellite imagery, local military liaisons, all the traditional resources, but we couldn't identify the pattern. James paused, looking out the window at the morning city skyline. Finally, one of our interpreters suggested we talk to an old woman who sold fruit by the side of the road. Everyone thought he was crazy. What could an illiterate fruit vendor tell us that our sophisticated intelligence apparatus couldn't figure out? What happened? She had been watching that road for 40 years. She knew exactly when the attacks would happen because she recognized the patterns in local behavior that preceded them. Information that was invisible to us was obvious to her. Her observations saved dozens of lives and allowed us to complete the mission. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as she understood the parallel James was drawing. You're that fruit vendor, Maria. You see patterns and problems that are invisible to everyone else because you're present but not part of the system you're observing. That's an incredibly valuable perspective. Maria sat quietly for several minutes, processing everything James had told her. The rational part of her mind was listing all the reasons why this was impossible, why she wasn't qualified, why she should stick to what she knew. But a stronger part of her, a part that had been dormant for years, was stirring with excitement and possibility. What if I mess this up? She asked finally. What if you don't? James countered. Maria, in my experience, the biggest risks come from not taking calculated chances, not from taking them. Through the conference room windows, Maria could see other employees beginning to arrive for the day. Soon, the office would be filled with people who had never really seen her despite her being there every morning for 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might be about to help solve their problems by leveraging her very invisibility. I have one condition, Maria said suddenly. James raised an eyebrow. What's that? I want to keep cleaning while I do this consulting work, at least at first. I don't want to lose my regular income, and I think I can observe better if people still see me as just the cleaning lady. James grinned, and Maria caught a glimpse of the Special Forces officer he had been, someone who understood the value of maintaining cover while gathering intelligence. That's brilliant, Maria. Absolutely brilliant. You'll be operating in plain sight while collecting the most valuable data in the building. As they shook hands on their agreement, Maria felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and valued for her mind rather than just her willingness to work hard at invisible tasks. She had no idea how dramatically this opportunity would change not just her life, but her entire understanding of her own capabilities. When do we start? She asked. We already have, James replied. Welcome to the consulting business partner. Outside the conference room, Henderson and Associates was coming to life for another day, with no one suspecting that their cleaning lady had just become their most important consultant. Maria gathered her cleaning supplies and headed toward her first office of the day, but everything felt different now. She wasn't just emptying trash cans and wiping down desks anymore. She was gathering intelligence that could transform an entire company. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, Maria caught her reflection in a window and barely recognized herself. She looked the same on the outside, but inside, something fundamental had changed. For the first time in her adult life, she felt like she was about to discover what she was truly capable of achieving. 2 weeks into her new role as James's consulting partner, Maria had filled 3 notebooks with observations that would have shocked the executives at Henderson and Associates. Working under the cover of her cleaning duties, she had gathered intelligence that painted a dramatically different picture of the company's problems than what the management team had imagined. That Thursday morning, as Maria methodically documented her findings in the conference room before the office came to life, she reflected on how much her perspective had changed. What had once seemed like routine workplace chaos now revealed itself as a complex web of systemic problems that no traditional consultant would have uncovered. The real bottleneck isn't technology or communication, she explained to James as he reviewed her notes from the previous day. It's trust. James looked up from the notebook where Maria had documented 17 separate incidents of employees withholding information, working around official procedures, or duplicating efforts because they didn't trust the systems or people they were supposed to rely on. "Explain what you mean," he said, though his expression suggested he was beginning to see the pattern she had identified. Maria pulled out her first notebook and flipped to a page covered with her careful handwriting. Take yesterday, for example. I was cleaning Mr.'s office when he got a call from a client asking about project status. Instead of checking the official project management system, he called 3 different team members individually to get updates. Maybe the system isn't user-friendly, James suggested. That's what I thought initially. But then I overheard those same team members talking in the break room later. They all knew the system had the correct information, but they also knew doesn't trust it because last month there was incorrect data in there for 2 days before anyone fixed it. James made a note, so he's creating inefficiency because of one past experience. It gets worse. Because calls them individually instead of trusting the system, those team members now think he doesn't trust them to maintain accurate data. So they've started keeping their own backup records and double-checking everything, which takes extra time and creates opportunities for discrepancies. Maria showed James another page of notes. I've identified 11 different unofficial backup systems that various employees have created because they don't trust the official ones. The accounting department keeps spreadsheets that duplicate information in the financial software. The marketing team prints out email chains for important decisions because they don't trust digital storage. The IT department has started storing critical passwords in a physical notebook instead of the password management system. James whistled softly, a vicious cycle of distrust creating the very inefficiencies that reinforce the distrust. Exactly, and it's not just systems, it's people too. Maria flipped to another section. I've watched Sarah, the senior project manager, redo work that junior staff members have already completed, not because it's wrong, but because she doesn't trust them to catch potential problems. Is their work actually problematic? Sometimes, but not usually. The real problem is that Sarah never provides feedback when she fixes things, so the junior staff never learn what they're doing wrong. They just know their work gets changed without explanation, which makes them trust their own judgment less and become more dependent on her review. Maria had spent hours analyzing these patterns, and the more she observed, the clearer the picture became. Henderson and Associates wasn't suffering from technical problems or poor procedures. They were trapped in a web of defensive behaviors that had evolved over time as employees learned not to rely on systems or colleagues. I think I know why the traditional consulting approaches haven't worked, Maria continued. When you interview managers about problems, they talk about symptoms, missed deadlines, communication failures, quality issues. But they don't want to admit that they don't trust their own systems or employees because that sounds like a leadership failure. James leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. And the employees won't admit to the backup systems and workarounds because they think they'll get in trouble for not following procedures. Right, so everyone talks about needing better technology or clearer procedures, when the real problem is that perfectly good technology and procedures are being undermined by a culture of defensive behavior. Over the next hour, Maria walked James through case study after case study from her notebooks. The receptionist who kept personal copies of important messages because the official system had lost data 6 months ago. The finance director who required paper signatures on electronic approvals because he didn't trust the digital workflow. The team leads who held redundant meetings because they didn't trust that information from the official meetings would reach everyone who needed it. Each individual behavior made sense as a defensive response to a past problem. But collectively, they were creating far more inefficiency and opportunities for error than the original issues they were meant to prevent. The most revealing thing, Maria said, is what happens during crisis situations. Last week, when the project had an emergency deadline change, I watched the entire office transform. How so? Suddenly, all the backup systems and defensive behaviors disappeared. People shared information directly, trusted each other to do their jobs, used the official systems without double-checking everything. They accomplished in 4 hours what normally takes them 2 days. James nodded slowly. Crisis forced them to cooperate and trust each other because the alternative was obvious failure. Exactly, which proves that the systems and people are perfectly capable of working efficiently. The problem is that under normal circumstances, the perceived cost of trust feels higher than the cost of inefficiency. Maria had also observed something else that fascinated her. The employees who were most efficient and least stressed were those who had found ways to maintain trust despite the organizational culture. They were typically people who had developed strong personal relationships that allowed them to bypass the defensive systems, or newer employees who hadn't yet learned to distrust the official processes. There's something else, Maria said, pulling out her most recent notebook. I think I know why this culture of distrust developed, and it's not what you'd expect. She showed James a timeline she had constructed by piecing together conversations and observations. 18 months ago, Henderson and Associates went through a major growth period. They hired a lot of new people quickly and implemented several new systems simultaneously. Growing pains, James observed. But the leadership team, trying to ensure quality during rapid expansion, instituted a lot of oversight and review processes. Multiple approval steps, mandatory peer reviews, frequent check-ins, all reasonable precautions during a period of change. Let me guess, the temporary precautions became permanent habits. Maria nodded. The oversight processes taught everyone that their initial work wasn't trusted. The multiple approval steps taught managers that they needed to double-check everything. The frequent reviews taught employees that their judgment was constantly being questioned. She showed James notes from conversations she had overheard between employees who had been with the company during that transition period. The defensive behaviors had started as rational responses to increased oversight, but they had become ingrained habits that persisted long after the original reasons for caution had disappeared. So the company accidentally trained its own employees not to trust each other, James said. And now they're all trapped in behaviors that feel necessary for self-protection, but are actually creating the very problems they're trying to avoid. As other employees began arriving for the day, Maria closed her notebooks and gathered her cleaning supplies. But before she left the conference room, James stopped her. Maria, what you've uncovered here is extraordinary. This analysis would have taken a traditional consulting team months to develop, and they probably never would have identified the trust issue because people don't admit to trust problems in interviews. Maria felt a warm flush of pride, but also a growing sense of responsibility. So what do we do with this information? How do we fix a culture of distrust? James smiled. That's what we're going to figure out next week, but first I want you to focus on one more thing in your observations. What's that? I want you to identify the moments when people do trust each other, when the system works the way it's supposed to. I have a theory that the solution isn't to eliminate defensive behaviors, but to create conditions where trust feels safer than distrust. As Maria headed out to begin her cleaning rounds, she felt a familiar thrill at having a new puzzle to solve. But more than that, she was beginning to realize that her unique position had given her insights that could genuinely help people. The employees at Henderson and Associates weren't lazy or incompetent. They were trapped in defensive patterns that were making their work lives more difficult and stressful than necessary. For the first time in her life, Maria felt like she wasn't just working to pay bills. She was working to solve problems that mattered, using skills she hadn't even known she possessed. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, she wasn't just the invisible cleaning lady anymore. She was a detective, gathering clues to unlock the mystery of why good people with good intentions were struggling to work effectively together. The most remarkable thing was that her invisibility, which had once made her feel unimportant, had become her greatest asset. She could observe genuine behavior and real dynamics in a way that no traditional consultant ever could. She was seeing the truth about how organizations actually functioned beneath their official procedures and polished presentations. By the time Maria finished her morning rounds, she had already identified 3 more instances of trust-building behavior that she wanted to discuss with James. She was no longer just documenting problems. She was beginning to envision solutions. And for the first time since taking this opportunity, she was starting to believe that she might actually be able to help transform not just a company, but the working lives of everyone in it. 3 weeks after beginning her investigation into trust dynamics at Henderson and Associates, Maria found herself in a situation she had never imagined possible. She was sitting at the head of the main conference table, facing 12 senior executives, preparing to present findings that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their company. The morning had started like any other, with Maria arriving early to complete her cleaning duties before the 9 a.m. presentation. But as she prepared the conference room, setting out water glasses and adjusting chairs, she felt a nervous energy that had nothing to do with physical work. In 2 hours, she would transition from invisible service worker to expert consultant, and she still couldn't quite believe it was really happening. James had spent the previous week helping Maria organize her findings into a professional presentation, but he had insisted that she be the one to deliver it. "This is your intelligence, your analysis," he had said. "You're the expert here, not me." The transformation hadn't been easy. Maria had practiced her presentation dozens of times, first alone in her apartment, then with her daughter Sophia providing encouragement and feedback, and finally with James offering suggestions on structure and delivery. The hardest part hadn't been learning to speak confidently in front of executives. It had been learning to trust that her insights were valuable enough to deserve their attention. At exactly 9 a.m., the executives began filing into the conference room. Maria watched them take their seats, recognizing each person from her weeks of observation, but seeing them now from an entirely different perspective. These weren't just sources of trash, an office mess to be cleaned up after. They were complex individuals trapped in dysfunctional patterns that they didn't fully understand. Robert Henderson, the founding partner, took his usual seat at the opposite end of the table. Maria had observed him during countless late-night phone calls, had seen his frustration with declining productivity, had witnessed his genuine care for his employees despite his struggles to connect with them. Beside him sat the operations director, whose defensive behaviors Maria had documented extensively, but whose underlying competence and dedication were equally clear. James made a brief introduction, explaining how Maria's unique position had allowed her to gather observational data that traditional consulting methods couldn't access. He was careful not to reveal that Maria was currently employed as a cleaner. They had decided that information should come from Maria herself if she chose to share it. "Ladies and," James concluded, "I'd like you to meet Maria Santos, specialist in operational observation and organizational efficiency analysis. Her findings are going to surprise you." Maria stood up, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She had prepared for this moment, but the reality of addressing people she had cleaned up after for 3 years felt surreal. "Thank you for agreeing to hear my analysis," she began. "Over the past month, I've been conducting detailed observational research on workflow patterns, communication dynamics, and operational efficiency here at Henderson and Associates. What I discovered is that your company doesn't have the problems you think it has." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a simple diagram comparing official procedures with observed behaviors. "You believe you're dealing with communication breakdowns, outdated technology, and poor project management. But these are symptoms, not causes. Your real challenge is what I call defensive efficiency syndrome." Maria explained her concept methodically, drawing on specific examples from her notebooks while being careful not to embarrass individuals. She described how rational defensive behaviors had evolved into systemic inefficiencies, how employees had learned to distrust perfectly functional systems, and how the organization was trapped in cycles that reinforced the very problems they were trying to solve. The room was completely silent, as Maria presented case study after case study. She showed them the hidden costs of parallel record-keeping systems, the time wasted on redundant verification processes, and the communication breakdowns that occurred not because of poor technology, but because of learned distrust of that technology. The most important finding, Maria continued, is that this isn't about incompetent people or broken systems. During crisis situations, when defensive behaviors become impossible to maintain, this organization functions with remarkable efficiency. The deadline emergency last month proved that your people and systems are completely capable of high performance. Leaned forward. But how could you possibly know about internal operational details? What's your background in organizational analysis? This was the moment Maria had been preparing for. She looked around the table at faces she knew intimately from months of invisible observation and made her choice. My background is 3 years of cleaning your offices every morning while you worked around problems that seemed obvious to me but invisible to you, she said calmly. I'm the person who empties your trash, cleans your conference rooms, and observes how this company actually functions when people think no one is watching. The silence that followed was profound. Maria watched expressions shift from confusion to surprise to something that looked like embarrassment. But she also saw recognition dawning in several faces. People were beginning to understand how much she had seen and learned during her invisible presence in their workplace. Robert Henderson was the first to speak. You're telling us that our cleaning lady has been conducting management consulting analysis. I'm telling you that someone with unique access to unfiltered organizational behavior has identified patterns that explain your efficiency problems, Maria replied firmly. My job title doesn't change the validity of the data or the accuracy of the analysis. James stepped in smoothly. Maria's observational position allowed her to gather intelligence that no traditional consultant could access. People behave differently when they think they're being evaluated versus when they think they're unobserved. Maria continued her presentation, now with a slightly different energy in the room. Some executives were clearly struggling to adjust their perceptions, but others seemed genuinely curious about her findings. She presented her analysis of trust-building behaviors, showed them examples of when their systems worked perfectly, and outlined the conditions that enabled high performance. The solution isn't new technology or additional oversight, she explained. The solution is creating conditions where trust feels safer than defensive behavior. She outlined her recommendations: reducing redundant approval processes, implementing transparent feedback systems, creating safe channels for reporting system failures, and establishing regular trust-building exercises that would help employees feel confident in relying on their colleagues and official procedures. But most importantly, Maria said, you need to acknowledge that the defensive behaviors developed for good reasons. Telling people to just trust the system won't work if you don't address the experiences that taught them not to trust it in the first place. As Maria concluded her presentation, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had spent 45 minutes presenting complex organizational analysis to senior executives, and she had done it competently and confidently. More importantly, she had presented insights that could genuinely help solve problems and improve people's working lives. The questions that followed were thoughtful and engaged, wanted details about specific workflow improvements. The IT director was fascinated by Maria's observations about system workarounds and asked for recommendations on rebuilding user confidence. Robert Henderson requested copies of her trust-building analysis for further study. But the most meaningful moment came when David, Sarah's husband and a junior partner, spoke up. Maria, I have to ask, how long have you been watching us struggle with these problems? How long have you known what was really going wrong? Maria considered the question carefully. I've been observing inefficiencies for years, but I only understood them as systemic problems after James helped me analyze the patterns. Before that, I just saw individual behaviors that seemed wasteful or stressful. And you never said anything. Maria felt a flutter of her old invisibility, but pushed through it. Mister, when would I have said something? Who would have listened to observations from the cleaning staff about management strategies? This is the first time anyone has ever asked for my perspective on anything other than whether the bathrooms need more soap. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was reflective. Maria could see people processing not just her analysis, but the realization that valuable insights had been available to them for years from a source they had never thought to consult. Robert Henderson finally spoke. "Ms. Santos, your analysis is remarkably thorough and frankly humbling. I'd like to discuss implementing your recommendations, but first I have a question about your role going forward." Maria felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, James mentioned you specialize in observational analysis. Would you be interested in continuing that work here in an official capacity?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Maria had assumed about her career limitations and future possibilities. She looked around the table at executives who an hour earlier had seen her only as part of the building's service infrastructure, and who were now seriously considering her for a consulting role. "I would be very interested in that conversation," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. As the meeting ended, and executives filed out discussing implementation plans and timeline details, James approached Maria with a grin that reminded her of their first conversation in the break room. "Well, partner," he said, "I think it's safe to say you've officially graduated from the cleaning business." Maria looked around the conference room where she had just delivered the most important professional presentation of her life and realized that James was right. She was no longer just someone who cleaned up after other people's work. She was someone whose work could help other people be more effective and satisfied in their professional lives. Girl who had left school at 16 to support her family, who had spent 12 years believing that cleaning was the best she could do, had just proven that observation, intelligence, and determination could overcome any limitation that others might place on her potential. 6 months later, Maria Santos walked through the doors of Meridian Tower wearing a tailored business suit and carrying a leather briefcase, but she still arrived at 5:30 a.m. Some habits, she had discovered, were worth keeping. The early morning hours remained her most productive time, though now she used them for reviewing client files and preparing presentations rather than cleaning offices. The transformation of Henderson and Associates had been remarkable to witness. Implementation of Maria's recommendations had begun within days of her presentation, and the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Trust-building workshops had replaced redundant approval processes. Transparent feedback systems had eliminated most of the defensive backup procedures. Employee satisfaction scores had increased by 40%, and productivity metrics showed consistent improvement across all departments. But the most meaningful change for Maria was personal. She now occupied the corner office that had once housed visiting consultants, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture, and a nameplate that read Maria Santos, Senior Organizational Analyst. The girl who had spent years making other people's workspaces clean and comfortable now had her own workspace where others came to seek her expertise. That morning, as Maria reviewed notes for her 9 a.m. client meeting, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The transition from cleaning lady to consultant hadn't been smooth or simple. There had been moments of doubt, instances where she questioned whether she belonged in conference rooms and strategy sessions, times when she felt like an imposter wearing professional clothes and giving advice to people with advanced degrees. The breakthrough had come when she realized that her value didn't lie in pretending to be something she wasn't, but in embracing the unique perspective that her background provided. She approached organizational problems differently than traditional consultants because she had learned to see workplace dynamics from the bottom up rather than the top down. Her insights were valuable precisely because they came from a viewpoint that most analysts never experienced. James knocked on her door frame and entered with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they had maintained from their first conversation in the break room. He was no longer just her mentor and partner. Henderson and Associates had hired him as Director of Strategic Development, and together they had created the most successful consulting team the firm had ever employed. "Ready for the industry's presentation?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Maria nodded, though she felt the familiar flutter of nervous excitement that preceded important meetings. Industries was their largest potential client, a manufacturing company with 1,500 employees and efficiency problems that had stumped 3 previous consulting firms. If they landed this contract, it would establish their methodology as a genuine innovation in organizational analysis. "I still can't believe they specifically requested our approach," Maria said, reviewing the project proposal one final time. 6 months ago, I was emptying their CEO's wastebasket when he visited Henderson and Associates. Now he wants to hire me to analyze his entire operation. James smiled. He wants to hire you because word has spread about what you accomplished here. The Henderson transformation has become a case study in business schools. People are starting to understand that observational intelligence can solve problems that traditional analysis misses. It was true. The success at Henderson and Associates had attracted attention from business publications, consulting organizations, and academic researchers. Maria had been invited to speak at conferences, contribute to articles about innovative management approaches, and participate in panel discussions about overlooked sources of organizational insight. The most surreal moment had come when business school contacted her about developing a case study based on her methodology. The professor who called had been particularly interested in how Maria's background had shaped her analytical approach, and whether similar insights might be available from other, invisible, employees in organizations. "Are you nervous about the presentation?" James asked. Maria considered the question honestly. "A little, but not the way I used to be. I'm not nervous about whether my analysis is valuable. I know it is. I'm nervous about whether I can communicate it effectively to people who might not be ready to hear it." That was the ongoing challenge of her new role. Some executives embraced the idea that cleaning staff, security guards, maintenance workers, and other service employees might have valuable insights about organizational efficiency. Others struggled to accept that formal education and traditional credentials weren't the only sources of business wisdom. Maria had learned to navigate these dynamics by focusing on results rather than backgrounds, by presenting data and analysis that spoke for itself regardless of its source. She had also discovered that her direct communication style, developed through years of practical work, was often more effective than the complex jargon that many consultants use to obscure simple concepts. At 8:45 a.m., Maria and James made their way to the main conference room where they would present their proposal to the industry's leadership team. Maria felt completely comfortable in the space now, but she still remembered the first time she had addressed executives from this same table, when revealing her cleaning background had felt like a risky confession rather than a professional credential. The team filed in promptly at 9 a.m., led by CEO Richard himself. Maria had researched each attendee carefully, understanding their backgrounds, challenges, and communication preferences. It was a skill she had developed during her consulting work. The same observational abilities that had made her an exceptional cleaner also made her highly effective at reading people and adapting her approach to different audiences. "Mr. Thank you for considering our proposal," Maria began. "Before we discuss specific methodologies, I'd like to explain why traditional consulting approaches have been unsuccessful with your efficiency challenges." She clicked to her opening slide, which showed a diagram of typical organizational analysis methods. Most consultants study your company by interviewing managers, reviewing official procedures, and analyzing performance data. These approaches provide valuable information, but they miss the reality of how work actually gets done day to day. Maria explained her observational methodology, describing how embedded analysis could reveal hidden inefficiencies, informal workaround systems, and trust dynamics that never appeared in official reports or management interviews. She showed examples from the Henderson transformation, careful to protect confidentiality while demonstrating the power of her approach. "What makes your methodology different?" Richard asked. "Is that you observe actual behavior rather than reported behavior." "Exactly, and more importantly, I observe from positions where people behave naturally rather than. When employees know they're being evaluated, they modify their behavior. When they think they're unobserved, you see the real operational patterns." Maria presented her preliminary assessment of industries based on publicly available information and initial site visits. She had identified several indicators that suggested trust and communication issues similar to what she had found at Henderson and Associates, but adapted to a manufacturing environment rather than a service business. "Our proposal involves a 6-week embedded analysis phase," she explained, "during which I would work alongside your operational staff in various capacities to observe workflow patterns, communication dynamics, and informal problem-solving systems." One of the VPs looked skeptical. "You're suggesting that you work on our production floor and in our warehouses?" "Among other places, yes. I'd also spend time in your administrative areas, break rooms, maintenance departments, and anywhere else that real work happens outside of formal meetings and official procedures. Maria had learned to address this skepticism directly. I understand this might seem unconventional, but consider that your efficiency problems have persisted despite analysis by 3 respected consulting firms using traditional methods. Perhaps a different approach is necessary. James presented the technical aspects of their proposal timeline, deliverables, success metrics, and implementation support. But Maria could see that the real decision would be based on whether the team was willing to trust an unconventional methodology that challenged assumptions about where valuable business insights originated. Richard asked the question that Maria had been expecting. Ms. Santos, can you tell us about your background in organizational analysis? This was the moment that had once filled Maria with anxiety, but now felt like an opportunity to differentiate their approach. My background is 12 years of observing workplace dynamics from positions where I could see how organizations actually function rather than how they're supposed to function. I developed my analytical framework by recognizing patterns in human behavior and system performance that became visible through sustained, unfiltered observation. She paused, maintaining eye contact with, I don't have an MBA or a background in traditional consulting. What I have is a proven ability to identify operational problems that other analytical methods miss, and to develop solutions that address root causes rather than symptoms. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative. Maria could see the team processing the implications of her approach, weighing the unconventional methodology against the conventional methods that had failed to solve their problems. Finally, Richard spoke. Ms. Santos, your success at Henderson and Associates speaks for itself. But I have to ask, how do we know this methodology will work in a manufacturing environment? Service companies and production facilities have very different dynamics. Maria smiled. You're absolutely right that the environments are different, but human behavior patterns are remarkably consistent across different types of organizations. People develop workarounds for inefficient systems. They create informal communication networks when official channels don't work, and they lose trust in procedures when those procedures prove unreliable. She clicked to a new slide showing comparative analysis from several industries. I've now applied this methodology in service companies, legal firms, healthcare organizations, and even government agencies. The specific problems vary, but the underlying dynamics of trust, communication, and system effectiveness are universal. The presentation concluded with a detailed implementation plan and timeline for delivering results. As the team filed out to deliberate, Maria felt confident that she had presented their methodology effectively. But she also knew that the decision would ultimately depend on whether the client was ready to embrace a radically different approach to solving persistent problems. James closed his laptop and looked at Maria with an expression that mixed pride and amazement. You know, 6 months ago you were worried about whether you belonged in a conference room. Now you're presenting to Fortune 500 CEOs like you've been doing it your entire career. Maria gathered her materials, thinking about James's observation. I think I've finally figured out what changed. It's not that I learned to belong in conference rooms. It's that I learned that conference rooms need people who understand what happens outside of them. 2 hours later, Richard called to inform them that Industries wanted to move forward with the full proposal. As Maria hung up the phone, she realized that she had traveled further than she ever imagined possible, from invisible service worker to recognized expert in organizational analysis. But perhaps the most remarkable part of her journey was the discovery that the skills and perspectives that had made her exceptional at cleaning attention to detail, systematic observation, understanding of how things actually worked rather than how they appeared to work, were the same skills that made her exceptional at consulting. Maria Santos had learned that there was no such thing as just anything. Every role, every perspective, every form of honest work contained insights and abilities that could transform not only individual lives, but entire organizations. She had been far more than just a cleaning lady. She had been an unrecognized expert in human behavior and operational efficiency, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and value the right answers. As she looked out her office window at the city below, Maria felt grateful for the challenge that had changed her life. James's willingness to see potential where others saw only service work had opened a door to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But more importantly, it had taught her to see those same possibilities in herself.